Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds, well, aggressively unexciting. Watermills. Yes, those creaky wooden contraptions that sat by rivers and made flour. But before you roll your eyes and think, wow, I'm about to fall asleep already, exactly. That's the point. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift back to a time when the height of technological innovation was a wheel that got wet now. Medieval people were not exactly known for their cutting-edge tech. This was the same era where bathing was considered suspicious and dentistry was basically hope for the best. But watermills, these were their pride and joy. They were the medieval equivalent of Wi-Fi. If your village had one, you were basically living in the future. And if you didn't, well, enjoy grinding grain by hand until your arms fell off. So, let's float gently into this world of damp wooden wheels, cranky millers, and the occasional lawsuit over who got to use the river first. Because yes, even in the Middle Ages, people were suing each other over water rights. Some things never change. The earliest watermills in Europe were popping up around the Roman period. But by the Middle Ages, they were everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. England alone had something like 6,000 of them by the time of the Doomsday Book in 1086. That's a lot of soggy wheels. Imagine being a Norman tax collector, trudging through the countryside, writing down, yes, another mill. Yes, another one. Oh look, another. It must have been the medieval version of counting Starbucks locations. But here's the thing. Watermills weren't just about flour. They were multi-purpose machines. They could hammer iron, crush olives, full cloth, and even saw wood. Basically, if you could attach it to a wheel, medieval people tried it. It was the original, there's an app for that. And of course, because this is medieval history, the people running these mills were often the most hated guys in town. The miller had a reputation for being greedy, dishonest, and just generally unpleasant. Which makes sense, because he controlled the bread supply. If you wanted to eat, you had to deal with him, and he always took a cut. Always. Let's pause here and picture the scene. A sleepy village, a river trickling by, a wooden wheel turning slowly, creaking with every rotation. Inside, a miller covered in flour dust, looking like he hasn't smiled since the last coronation. He's weighing your grain, and somehow, mysteriously, the scales always tip in his favor. You complain, but what are you going to do? Sue him? Good luck with that. The local lord probably owns the mill anyway, and he's getting his cut to dot. This is why millers show up in medieval literature as shady characters. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales has a miller who's basically a drunk scam artist. And that wasn't just fiction. It was a stereotype everyone recognized. If you were a miller, you were basically the medieval version of a used car salesman now. Let's talk about the actual mechanics, because nothing says bedtime story like the soothing hum of engineering details. The water wheel itself came in two main flavors, undershot and overshot. Undershot wheels were the simpler kind. The river just pushed against the bottom of the wheel and it turned. Easy, cheap, not very efficient. Overshot wheels, on the other hand, were the fancy ones. Water poured over the top, and gravity did the work. Much more efficient, but you needed hills or aqueducts to make it happen. So, if your village was flat, tough luck, and, of course, medieval people being medieval people, they argued endlessly about which type was better. Some lords insisted on overshot wheels because they looked more impressive. Others stuck with undershot because they were cheaper to build. It was basically the medieval version of arguing about iPhone versus Android. But here's where it gets fun. Watermills weren't just machines. They were social hubs. People gathered there, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Everyone needed flour, so the mill became this weird mix of workplace, gossip center, and low-key extortion racket. You'd show up with your grain, wait in line, complain about the miller, and catch up on who in the village had just died of dysentery. And because mills were so central, they became symbols of power. Lords would fight over who got to control them. Monasteries built them to show off their wealth. Kings taxed them. And peasants, well, peasants just kept grinding their grain and grumbling. Let's float over to another detail. The sound. Imagine lying in bed in a medieval village. No cars, no planes, just the occasional donkey braying. And in the distance, the steady creak and splash of the mill wheel turning all night. It must have been oddly soothing. Unless, of course, you were the miller, who had to get up at dawn to unclog the wheel from whatever random debris had floated downstream. Logs, dead animals, the occasional unlucky goose, all part of the job. And because this is medieval history, we can't forget the church. The church had opinions about mills. Monasteries loved them because they made money. But theologians sometimes worried that mills encouraged laziness. After all, wasn't grinding grain by hand a good, honest, character-building activity? Did God really want us to outsource it to a wheel? This was the kind of debate that kept monks up at night. Well, that and whether angels had elbows. We're only scratching the surface here, but you can already see how something as boring as a watermill was actually tangled up in medieval life. Technology, economy, religion, gossip, corruption, all turning together, like the wheel itself. And that's where we'll keep drifting tonight. From the creaky, undershot wheels of England, to the grand, overshot mills of France, to the bizarre legal disputes where two lords argued over who owned the river. Spoiler, neither of them asked the fish dot. So, we've got our sleepy village, our creaky wheel, and our grumpy miller. But let's zoom out a little, because watermills weren't just about bread. They were about control. Whoever owned the mill basically owned the stomachs of everyone around. And in the Middle Ages, that was serious leverage. Lords knew this, which is why they often claimed what was called a banal right. That meant peasants were legally required to use their mill, and only their mill. You couldn't just build your own little wheel in the backyard. Oh no, that would be stealing from the Lord. So you trudged to his mill, paid his fees, and grumbled under your breath. It was feudalism at its finest. You work, he profits. And of course, the miller was the middleman. He took his cut, the Lord took his cut, and by the time you got your flour back, you were wondering if you'd accidentally dropped half your grain in the river. Spoiler, you hadn't. Now, let's talk about the actual look of these mills. Picture a squat wooden building, usually with a thatched roof, sitting right on the riverbank. The wheel itself could be massive, sometimes taller than a man. It turned slowly, steadily, with that hypnotic creak. Inside, the gears were all made of wood, carefully fitted together. The millstones, two giant circular slabs of stone, ground against each other, crushing the grain. The sound was a constant low rumble, like distant thunder. And here's the fun part. Millstones had to be dressed. Not in clothes, obviously, but carved with grooves to keep them sharp. This was a whole craft in itself. Millstone dressers traveled from village to village, carving neat little patterns into the stone. Without them, the mill just smeared the grain into a sad paste. So yes, even in the Middle Ages, there were traveling specialists who showed up, did their job, and left before anyone could ask too many questions. Let's float over to the economics for a moment, because mills were money machines. Literally, some lords made more from their mills than from their fields. And monasteries. They were mill fanatics. Monks loved efficiency, and mills were the perfect way to turn prayer into profit. A monastery with a good mill could feed itself, sell surplus flour, and look very pious while doing it. But of course, this led to disputes. Rivers don't exactly respect property lines. If your neighbor upstream built a mill, it could mess with your water supply. Cue endless lawsuits. Medieval courts were clogged with cases about who had the right to divert a stream, who owned the riverbank, and whether someone's new mill was stealing water. Imagine being a medieval lawyer, spending your career arguing about puddles. And then there's the superstition, because naturally, people thought mills were a little uncanny. The constant turning, the strange noises at night, the fact that the miller always seemed to have more money than anyone else. Some villagers whispered that millers had deals with the devil. Others thought mills were haunted. And honestly, if you've ever been inside an old wooden mill at night, with the creaking gears and shadows moving on the walls, you'd probably agree. But let's not forget the human side. The miller's family usually lived right there in the mill itself. Kids grew up falling asleep to the sound of grinding stones. Wives managed the accounts, or sometimes ran the mill when their husbands were too drunk to function, which, according to the stereotypes, was fairly often. And the children, they inherited the trade, along with the reputation. Being a miller's kid meant everyone assumed you were just as shady as your dad. Now, here's a detail I love. Medieval people sometimes paid their milling fees in kind. Not just coins, but chickens, eggs, or even labor. So, the miller's yard was often full of random animals, wandering around, clucking and bleating. Imagine trying to run a business while tripping over goats, and because the miller was always taking a cut, he often had the best food in town. Fresh bread, meat, ale, which of course made everyone hate him even more. Nothing breeds resentment like watching your neighbor eat roast goose while you're stuck with turnip stew. Let's drift back to the technology for a moment, because mills weren't static, they evolved. By the later Middle Ages, you had mills that could do all sorts of things. Fulling mills, for example, which pounded cloth to make it thicker and warmer. Imagine giant wooden hammers, lifted and dropped by the wheel, thudding away all day. The sound must have carried for miles. Then there were forge mills, crushing or powering bellows for smiths. The humble water wheel was basically the medieval engine, and yet, despite all this innovation, people still grumbled about them. Too noisy, too expensive, too much power in the hands of one man. Honestly, it's amazing how little changes so. To recap where we are in this sleepy drift, watermills were everywhere. They were essential, they were hated, and they were oddly spooky. They shaped medieval life in ways most people today don't even think about, and yet they've mostly been forgotten. When we picture the Middle Ages, we think castles, knights, plagues. But really, The steady creak of the mill wheel was just as much a part of daily life. And that's where we'll keep floating. Next, we'll wander into some specific stories, like the Doomsday Book's obsession with counting mills, or the bizarre disputes where entire villages went to war over a stream. Because nothing says medieval drama like two lords yelling at each other about water rights. So, we've established that mills were everywhere, that millers were shady, and that lords loved squeezing every last coin out of them. But let's drift into one of the most fascinating sources we have, the Doomsday Book, compiled in 1086 under William the Conqueror. It was basically the medieval census, except instead of asking how many bathrooms you had, it asked how many oxen, pigs, and, yes, mills. And the numbers are wild. Over 6,000 mills recorded in England alone, which means that in the late 11th century, there was roughly 1 mill for every 50 households. That's a lot of flour, and it shows just how central these things were. If you were a Norman tax collector trudging through muddy villages, you probably got sick of writing mill over and over. It must have felt like the medieval version of counting Starbucks locations in a modern city. Now, here's where it gets fun. Mills weren't just economic engines. They were also status symbols. If you were a lord and you had a mill, you weren't just feeding your peasants, you were showing off. It was like having a Tesla parked in your driveway. Except instead of sleek electric power, you had a giant wooden wheel splashing around in the river. Still, in the Middle Ages, that was impressive. And monasteries. They went all in. Some monasteries built entire complexes of mills, lined up along rivers, each one doing a different job. One for flour, one for fulling cloth, one for hammering iron. It was like a medieval industrial park, except run by monks in robes. Imagine walking past a monastery and hearing the constant thud of hammers, the splash of wheels, the rumble of millstones, all while the monks chanted in the background. It must have been a strange mix of holy and industrial. But of course, with great wheels came great problems. Rivers don't always cooperate. They flood, they dry up, they freeze, and when that happened, the mill stopped, which meant no flour, which meant no bread, which meant angry peasants. And angry peasants were not something you wanted in the Middle Ages. They didn't exactly have Yelp reviews, but they did have pitchforks. So, millers had to be resourceful. They built dams, channels, and sluices to control the water. Some of these were surprisingly sophisticated. In fact, medieval hydraulic engineering was way more advanced than people give it credit for. But of course, every time you diverted a stream, you annoyed someone downstream. Cue another lawsuit. Honestly, medieval courts must have been 50% water disputes, 50% land disputes, and maybe 1% witch trials. Let's float over to the cultural side. Because mills weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In medieval literature, the mill often stood for greed, corruption, or even lust. The miller was a stock character, fat, dishonest, usually drunk, and often involved in some scandal. Chaucer's Miller's Tale is the most famous example, but you see it everywhere. It's almost as if medieval people couldn't resist poking fun at the guy who controlled their bread supply. And honestly, who can blame them? Imagine handing over your hard-earned grain, only to watch the miller skim off the top, wink at you, and then head to the tavern. Of course, he was unpopular. Now, let's talk about the soundscape again. Because this is one of those details that really brings the past to life. Imagine lying in bed in a medieval village. No cars, no electricity, just the occasional dog barking, or maybe a rooster who didn't understand time zones. And in the distance, the steady creak and splash of the mill wheel. It must have been oddly soothing, like a medieval white noise machine. Unless, of course, you lived right next to it, in which case it was probably maddening. And here's a quirky fact: some mills were tidal. Yes, tidal. Built along the coast, they used the incoming and outgoing tide to turn the wheel, which is honestly genius. You're just sitting there, watching the ocean do all the work. But of course, it only worked twice a day when the tide was right. So, if you needed flour at the wrong time, tough luck. Come back later. Let's not forget the darker side, because mills could be dangerous. Those gears and wheels were massive, and if you got caught in them, well, let's just say you wouldn't be grinding grain anymore. There are records of accidents, of millers losing limbs, or worse. And of course, because this was the Middle Ages, people often interpreted these accidents as divine punishment. Oh, the miller lost his arm. Must have been cheating to many peasants. Convenient logic. So, where are we now in our sleepy drift? We've got mills as economic engines, mills as status symbols, mills as lawsuits waiting to happen, and mills as cultural metaphors. And we're still only scratching the surface, because next we'll wander into some specific case studies, like the epic disputes between monasteries over who got to control a river, or the way entire towns were built around a single mill. So, we've got our mills as status symbols, our millers as shady characters, and our peasants as perpetually annoyed customers. But let's wander into the legal swamp of medieval milling. Because if there's one thing medieval people loved almost as much as bread, it was suing each other over bread. Picture this: two lords, both with rivers running through their lands. One builds a mill upstream. Suddenly, the other guy's mill isn't turning as fast. Cue outrage. Cue lawyers. Cue a court case that drags on for years. And the peasants, they're stuck waiting for someone to decide whose flour is legally valid. It's the Middle Ages version of corporate patent wars, except instead of iPhones, it's soggy wheat. And the courts didn't make it simple. There were endless rules about who owned the water, who had the right to divert it, and how much flow was reasonable. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone got bread at all now. Let's float over to the architecture of these mills. Because they weren't just functional, they could be surprisingly beautiful. Some were simple wooden huts, sure, but others were stone-built, with arched windows, sturdy walls, and carefully carved sluices. In some towns, the mill was one of the most impressive buildings around. It stood there on the riverbank, humming away, a symbol of wealth and permanence, and inside, the machinery was a marvel of woodcraft. Gears, shafts, cogs, all carved from oak or elm, fitted together without nails, just wooden pegs and careful joinery. The whole thing creaked and groaned like a living creature. And in a way, it was. The mill was the beating heart of the village, turning day and night, feeding everyone. But of course, because this is medieval history, there's always a dark twist. Mills were notorious fire hazards. All that flour dust in the air, highly flammable. One stray spark, and the whole place could go up in flames. There are records of mills burning down spectacularly, leaving villagers scrambling for food. And naturally, people often blamed the miller, because if something went wrong, it was always the miller's fault. Let's not forget the economics of resentment. Because peasants didn't just dislike millers, they actively tried to avoid them. Some secretly built little hand mills at home called querns. Technically illegal, since the Lord wanted everyone to use his mill. But people did it anyway. And when they got caught, the punishment could be harsh. Lords sometimes confiscated the querns, smashed them, or fined the offenders. Imagine being dragged into court for the crime of grinding your own flour. That's feudalism in a nutshell. Now, let's drift into the symbolism of water itself. In medieval thought, water was life. Rivers were sacred, mysterious, sometimes dangerous. To harness a river with a wheel was almost magical. You were taking nature's power and bending it to human use. No wonder people thought mills were uncanny. They blurred the line between natural and artificial, between divine gift and human greed. And of course, the church had opinions. Some theologians praised mills as signs of God's providence. Others worried they encouraged sloth. After all, wasn't grinding grain by hand a good, honest, character-building activity? Did God really want us to outsource it to a wheel? This was the kind of debate that could keep a monk awake at night. Well, that and whether angels had elbows. Let's pause and imagine the daily rhythm of a mill. Dawn, the miller opens the sluice. Water rushes in, the wheel begins to turn. Villagers arrive with sacks of grain, waiting their turn. Inside, the stones grind steadily, filling the air with dust. The miller weighs the flour, takes his cut, and grins. By midday, the place is buzzing with gossip. Who's sick? Who's pregnant? Who's been cheating at dice? By evening, the wheel slows, the sluice is closed, and the miller counts his profits by candlelight. Day after day, year after year. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. And in the Middle Ages, steady was everything. And here's a quirky little detail. Mills sometimes doubled as defensive structures. Because they were sturdy, stone-built, and right on the water, they could be fortified in times of war. There are records of mills being used as makeshift castles, with archers firing from the windows while the wheel kept turning below. Imagine being besieged in a flour mill. Not exactly the stuff of epic poetry, but very medieval, so where are we now in our sleepy drift? We've got mills as economic engines, mills as symbols of power, mills as fire hazards, mills as lawsuits, and mills as low-key fortresses. And we're still only halfway through the story, because next we'll wander into some specific case studies, like the tidal mills of England, the massive mill complexes of France, and the bizarre disputes where entire monasteries went to war over a stream. So here we are, after wandering through the creaky world of medieval watermills. We've seen them as engines of bread, as symbols of power, as magnets for lawsuits, and as the backdrop for endless village gossip. We've met the miller, flour-dusted, slightly shady, always taking his cut, and we've heard the steady hum of the wheel turning day and night, like the heartbeat of the countryside. We've drifted past undershot wheels splashing lazily in flat rivers, and overshot wheels towering dramatically on hillsides. We've peeked into monasteries where monks turned rivers into industrial parks, and we've watched peasants sneak home with illegal hand mills, hoping not to get caught. We've seen mills burn, mills flood, mills collapse, and mills fortified like tiny castles. And through it all, the same rhythm: grain in, flour out, bread on the table. It's easy to forget, in our world of supermarkets and sliced loaves, just how central these damp wooden machines once were. They weren't glamorous, they weren't heroic, but they kept people alive. And in the Middle Ages, that was everything. So, we've left behind the village mill with its cranky miller and flour-dusted gossip. Now, let's float downstream to something a little more unusual. Tidal mills. Yes, medieval people figured out how to harness the ocean, which sounds impressive until you realize it only worked twice a day, when the tide came in or went out. Still, for the Middle Ages, that was basically wizardry. Picture it, a mill perched on the edge of a salt marsh, its wheel turning not with a river, but with the slow, inevitable pull of the moon. Twice a day, the tide would fill a pond behind a dam. Then, as the tide receded, sluices opened, water rushed out, and the wheel turned. Grain got ground, flour got made, and everyone congratulated themselves on being technological geniuses. Until, of course, the tide schedule didn't match the villagers' bread schedule. Imagine showing up with your grain at noon, only to be told, "Sorry, the tide won't be back until tonight." Now, let's wander inland again to the monasteries. Because if anyone loved a good mill, it was the monks. They weren't just praying all day, they were running businesses, and mills were at the heart of it. Some monasteries built entire chains of mills along rivers, each one dedicated to a different task. One for flour, one for cloth, one for iron. It was like a medieval industrial park, except everyone was wearing robes and chanting psalms. And of course, monasteries being monasteries, they didn't just build mills, they fought over them. There are records of monks suing each other over water rights, accusing rival abbeys of stealing streams, and even sabotaging each other's sluices. Imagine a group of solemn tonsured men sneaking out at night to block a rival's mill race. Not exactly holy behavior, but very human. Let's pause for a moment on the afterlives of abandoned mills. Because when a mill stopped working, maybe the river shifted, maybe the village declined. It didn't just vanish. The building often lingered, slowly decaying, roof sagging, wheel rotting, stones gathering moss. And people, being people, made up stories. Abandoned mills were said to be haunted. Ghostly millers grinding phantom grain, wheels turning with no water, strange lights flickering in the windows. And honestly, if you've ever stood near an old mill at dusk, you can see why. The creaking timbers, the shadows, the sound of water trickling through broken sluices. It's eerie. No wonder people thought spirits lingered there now. Let's drift into the economics of scale. Because by the later Middle Ages, some towns had multiple mills, each one serving hundreds of people. The income was enormous. Lords and abbots grew rich, millers grew fat, and peasants grew resentful. It was a whole ecosystem of grinding, both literal and social. And here's a fun little irony. While peasants were forbidden from using their own hand mills, the nobility sometimes kept private ones in their castles. Because of course they did. Rules were for peasants. If you were a duke, you weren't going to haul your grain down to the village mill and haggle with a flour-dusted drunk. You had your own wheel, thank you very much. Let's not forget the engineering quirks. Some mills were built directly into bridges. Yes, bridge mills. Imagine crossing a river on a stone bridge, and right below you, tucked into the arches, a water wheel turning steadily. Convenient, efficient, and probably very noisy. Travelers must have paused mid-bridge, listening to the rumble of the stones below, wondering if the whole thing was about to collapse. And then there's the symbolism of the wheel itself. In medieval thought, the wheel was a powerful image. The wheel of fortune, turning endlessly, lifting some up, casting others down. The mill wheel echoed that symbolism. always turning, always grinding, indifferent to who brought the grain. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone's wheat ended up between the same stones. A quiet reminder that life, like flour, gets ground down in the end. So, we've already peaked at tidal mills and monastic mill empires. But let's linger a little longer on the monks, because honestly, they were the unsung industrialists of the Middle Ages. Picture a monastery in the 12th century. High stone walls, chanting in the chapel and outside. A whole network of water channels feeding into mills. The monks weren't just grinding grain. They were fulling cloth, hammering iron, pressing olives, and sawing wood. It was like a medieval version of Silicon Valley, except instead of apps, they were producing flour and wool. And instead of venture capitalists, they had bishops. And of course, because monks were supposed to be humble, they always framed it as for the glory of God, which, sure, but also for the glory of their bank accounts. Some abbeys grew fabulously wealthy from their mills. And when rival monasteries tried to muscle in on their rivers, things got ugly. There are records of monks literally fighting over water rights. Imagine a group of tonsured men in robes, whacking each other with sticks over a sluice gate. Not exactly the image of serene holiness. Now, let's float over to the technology creep of mills. Because once people realized you could power a grindstone with water, they started asking, what else can we hook up to this wheel? The answer, pretty much everything. Fulling mills. These pounded cloth with giant wooden hammers, making it thicker and warmer. The sound must have been deafening. Thud, 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 all day long. Villagers probably heard it for miles. Forge mills, these powered bellows for blacksmiths, keeping the fires hot enough to work iron. Without them, medieval metalwork would have been far slower. Sawmills, these cut timber into planks. Imagine the relief of carpenters who no longer had to saw everything by hand. Paper mills, by the late Middle Ages, water wheels were even pulping rags into paper, which means that the humble mill helped pave the way for books, literacy, and eventually bedtime stories like this one. So yes, the creaky old water wheel was basically the medieval engine. It was the quiet ancestor of the factory. But of course, with innovation came resentment. Every time a new kind of mill appeared, someone complained. Fulling mills, for example, put some manual cloth workers out of business. They protested, sometimes violently. It's a reminder that technological disruption isn't new. Medieval peasants were already grumbling about machines, stealing their jobs centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Let's pause for a moment on the social life of mills, because they weren't just workplaces, they were gathering spots. People came with their grain, waited in line, and inevitably started talking. Who was sick? Who was pregnant? Who had been fined for using an illegal hand mill? The mill was like the medieval equivalent of a coffee shop, except instead of lattes, you got flour dust in your hair. And of course, the miller himself was always at the center of it. Covered in flour, slightly smug, always suspected of skimming a little extra. He was both essential and despised, which is why he shows up in so much medieval satire. If you wanted a stock character to represent greed or dishonesty, you picked a miller. It was practically a cliché now. Let's drift into the afterlives of mills again, because this is where things get spooky. Abandoned mills were magnets for ghost stories. People swore they heard phantom wheels turning at night, or saw ghostly figures carrying sacks of grain. Some even claimed the devil himself liked to lurk in old mills. And honestly, if you've ever stood near a ruined mill at dusk, with the water trickling through broken sluices and the timbers creaking in the wind, you can see why. It's eerie. And here's a quirky little detail. Mills sometimes became landmarks. Travelers used them as reference points. Turn left at the mill. Meet me by the mill. The inn is just past the mill. They were so common, so central, that they shaped the very geography of medieval life. Even today, you'll find villages in Europe with names like Millbrook, Millfield, or Millstone. The memory lingers in the landscape. So we've seen mills as engines of innovation, as haunted ruins, and as the pride of monasteries. But let's linger on the monastic obsession a little longer, because it really was something. Monks didn't just build mills for themselves. They built them for entire regions. Some abbeys became the de facto landlords of water power. If you lived near a powerful monastery, chances are you were grinding your grain at their mill, paying their fees, and indirectly funding their illuminated manuscripts. And the monks, they justified it all as part of their divine mission. After all, wasn't feeding the poor a holy duty? Of course, it was. And if they happened to get rich in the process, well, God works in mysterious ways. Now, let's drift into the politics of water. Because rivers were lifelines, and controlling them meant controlling people. Lords and abbots fought over mill rights, the way modern nations fight over oil. There are records of entire villages caught in the middle of disputes, their grain piling up while two noblemen argued about who owned the stream. And the peasants, they just wanted bread. It's a reminder that, in the Middle Ages, politics wasn't about ideology. It was about who got to grind the wheat. Let's pause on the engineering marvels again, because some medieval mills were astonishingly complex. Multi-wheeled mills with several wheels turning side by side, each powering a different machine. Mills with elaborate sluice systems, carefully regulating the flow of water. Mills built into bridges, their wheels tucked under the arches, turning steadily as travelers crossed above. These weren't just rustic huts. They were feats of engineering, and yet they were so common that people barely noticed them. And here's a detail I love: the sounds of the mill. We've talked about the creak of the wheel and the rumble of the stones. But inside, it was a whole symphony. The clatter of gears, the hiss of grain pouring into hoppers, the thud of sacks being dropped on the floor. The air was thick with flour dust, catching the light in little clouds. It must have been both mesmerizing and suffocating. And the miller, standing in the middle of it all, probably half deaf from the noise, still found ways to skim a little extra off the top dot now. Let's wander into the superstitions again. Because mills were uncanny places. Always turning, always grinding, even at night. People whispered that millers had pacts with the devil, that ghosts haunted the wheels, that witches used mills for their spells. And honestly, if you were a medieval peasant, standing in a creaky wooden building with giant stones grinding endlessly, it probably did feel a little supernatural. Let's not forget the economics of resentment, because peasants hated paying milling fees. They hated the Lord's banal right, which forced them to use his mill. They hated the miller's cut. And they hated the fact that, no matter how hard they worked, someone else always profited. Which is why, in times of revolt, mills were often among the first targets. Burn the mill, and you weren't just destroying a building. You were striking at the system itself. And yet, despite all the resentment, mills endured. They were too useful, too essential. Without them, life was harder. Grinding grain by hand was back-breaking work. So people grumbled, but they kept coming. Day after day, year after year, the wheel kept turning. We've already wandered through tidal mills, monastic empires, and the ghostly ruins of abandoned wheels. But let's linger on the rivalry between water and wind for a moment. Because by the later Middle Ages, the water mill had a new competitor, the windmill now. Windmills were flashy, tall, elegant, visible for miles. They looked impressive on the horizon, their sails turning gracefully in the breeze. Watermills, by contrast, were squat, damp, and smelled faintly of wet grain. But here's the thing, windmills were unreliable. No wind, no flower. Watermills, for all their creaks and floods, were steady. As long as the river flowed, the wheel turned. So, in many places, watermills remained the backbone of daily life, while windmills were more like the showy cousins who showed up at family gatherings and stole the attention. And of course, lords and abbots argued endlessly about which was better. Some invested heavily in windmills, others doubled down on water. It was the medieval version of Team iPhone versus Team Android. Let's float back to the miller's reputation, because it really is one of the most consistent themes in medieval culture. Millers were universally distrusted. They were accused of cheating, of skimming, of watering down flour. In some towns, they were even required to swear oaths of honesty before being allowed to operate. Which, of course, didn't stop them from cheating anyway. And yet, despite the suspicion, millers often became wealthy. They had steady income, access to food, and connections to the local lord, which made them resented, but also envied. It's a strange social position, essential, despised, and quietly powerful. Now, let's wander into the seasonal rhythms of mills, because rivers don't flow the same way year-round. In spring, snowmelt and rain could make the water surge, turning the wheel furiously. In summer, drought might slow it to a crawl. In winter, ice could freeze it solid. Millers had to adapt constantly, adjusting sluices, repairing wheels, and sometimes just waiting for nature to cooperate. And of course, every season brought its own complaints from the villagers. Too much water, the miller's fault. Too little water, also the miller's fault. Frozen wheel, definitely the miller's fault. It's no wonder they had a reputation for being grumpy. Let's pause on the geography of mills, because they weren't just plopped down randomly. They shaped entire landscapes. Villages grew up around them. Roads were built to reach them. Bridges were constructed near them. In some cases, entire towns were named after them. The mill wasn't just a building, it was a landmark, a hub, a center of gravity, and when a mill was abandoned, it left a scar. The river shifted, the fields changed, the village declined. You can still see traces of old mill races in the countryside today, little channels carved into the earth, long after the wheel itself has rotted away. Now, let's drift into the symbolism of grinding. Because medieval people loved metaphors, and the mill was a perfect one. Grain being crushed between stones became a symbol for human suffering, for fate, for the grinding down of life itself. Preachers used it in sermons. Poets used it in verses. The wheel turning endlessly became a reminder of time, of fortune, of the inevitability of death. Cheerful stuff, but very medieval. And here's a quirky little fact. Mills sometimes became centers of crime. Because they were isolated, noisy, and full of hiding places, they were perfect spots for shady dealings. There are records of mills being used for smuggling, for secret meetings, even for storing stolen goods. So, when people whispered that millers were dishonest, it wasn't always just about flour. Let's not forget the international spread. Watermills weren't just a European thing. They appeared in the Islamic world, in China, in India. Each culture adapted them to local conditions. In some places, they powered sugar mills. In others, they pressed oil. The basic idea, harnessing water to do work, was universal. Which makes sense. Rivers flow everywhere, and humans, being humans, always look for ways to make life a little easier. So, we've wandered through tidal mills, those strange contraptions that rose and fell with the moon. We've seen monasteries turn rivers into industrial parks. Monks in robes quietly running what were essentially medieval corporations. We've watched peasants grumble about fees, lords argue about water rights, and millers smirk behind their flour-dusted scales. We've heard the sounds, the creak of the wheel, the rumble of the stones, the thud of fulling hammers, the hiss of grain pouring into hoppers. We've seen the sights, mills tucked into bridges, mills looming on riverbanks, mills abandoned and left to ghosts. We've even felt the rhythms of the seasons, when rivers surged, slowed, or froze, and the whole village held its breath, waiting for the wheel to turn again. And through it all, the same quiet truth. The watermill was more than a machine. It was a symbol of power, a source of resentment, a hub of gossip, a landmark, a metaphor, and, without exaggeration, one of the foundations of medieval life. It was the steady heartbeat of the countryside, grinding away in the background while kings fought wars. Monks copied manuscripts, and peasants tried to survive another winter. So, we've let the water wheels creak and splash their way through medieval rivers. But by the late Middle Ages, a new rival appeared on the horizon, literally. The windmill, tall, elegant, and visible for miles. It was the flashy newcomer in the world of grinding grain. Now, windmills had a certain drama to them. Their sails turned gracefully against the sky, catching the breeze, while watermills sat squat and damp by the riverbank, smelling faintly of wet grain and mildew. If watermills were the dependable workhorses of medieval life, windmills were the show ponies. They looked impressive, they made a statement, and they were perfect for flat, windy regions where rivers weren't much help, but of course, they had their flaws. No wind, no flour, which meant that while watermills churned steadily day and night, windmills sometimes just stood there, looking picturesque but useless. Villagers would trudge up with their sacks of grain, only to be told, "Sorry, no breeze today. Try again tomorrow." Not exactly efficient. Let's pause on the geography of windmills. They thrived in places like the Low Countries, modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, where rivers were sluggish but the wind was constant. There, windmills became iconic, dotting the landscape like giant wooden sentinels. They didn't just grind grain either. They pumped water, drained marshes, sawed timber. In fact, without windmills, much of the Netherlands would still be underwater. So yes, the Dutch basically fought the sea with giant wooden fans, and somehow it worked. Now, let's drift back to the rivalry, because water and wind weren't just technologies. They were symbols. Watermills were old, established, tied to feudal lords and monasteries. Windmills were newer, more independent, often built by towns or private entrepreneurs. So, in a way, The rivalry between water and wind reflected the broader shift from medieval feudalism to early modern commerce. One was rooted in tradition, the other in innovation. And of course, people argued endlessly about which was better. Some insisted water was more reliable, others swore by the wind. It was the medieval version of arguing about whether books or e-readers are superior. Both worked. Both had their quirks. And both, in the end, coexisted. Let's not forget the cultural symbolism. Windmills quickly became romanticized. Poets and painters loved them. They stood tall against the sky, turning slowly, almost dreamily. Watermills, by contrast, kept their reputation as shady, damp, slightly sinister places. If you wanted a metaphor for honesty and hard work, you picked a windmill. If you wanted a metaphor for greed and corruption, you picked a watermill. And then, of course, there's Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, mistaking them for giants. That image stuck. Windmills became symbols of futility, of hopeless battles, of noble but misguided quests. Which is ironic, because in reality, they were incredibly practical. But literature has never let practicality get in the way of a good metaphor. Now, let's float into the engineering details. Windmills came in two main flavors, post mills and tower mills. Post mills were the earlier type. The whole structure sat on a giant post, and you could rotate the entire building to face the wind, which sounds impressive, until you realize it meant shoving an entire wooden house around every time the breeze shifted. Tower mills were the upgrade. Only the top part rotated, while the base stayed fixed. Much sturdier, much easier to manage, and far more iconic. Both types had their quirks, but both represented a leap forward in harnessing natural power. And here's a fun little irony. While windmills looked modern and progressive, they often faced the same resentment as watermills. Millers were still distrusted. Fees were still resented. People still tried to sneak in handmills at home. The technology changed, but the social dynamics stayed the same. So, we've already seen windmills as the flashy newcomers, towering over the landscape, while watermills sulked by their rivers. But let's linger on the social impact of windmills. Because they didn't just change how grain was ground. They changed how communities looked at the land itself in flat, windy regions like the Low Countries. Windmills became part of the skyline. Imagine walking across a marshy plain in the 14th century and seeing a row of sails turning slowly in the distance. They weren't just machines. They were landmarks. They told you where the village was, where the fields ended, where the marsh began. They were like medieval GPS, except instead of satellites, you had giant wooden fans creaking in the wind. Now, let's drift into the economics of windmills. Because just like watermills, they were money machines. Lords and towns invested heavily in them, charging fees for their use. And just like with watermills, peasants grumbled. The same complaints surfaced. The miller was cheating, the fees were too high, the flour was too coarse. Technology may have changed, but human nature didn't. And of course, there were the inevitable lawsuits. Because if you built a windmill, your neighbor might complain that it blocked his wind. Yes, medieval people actually argued in court about stolen breezes. Imagine standing before a judge, solemnly declaring that your neighbor's windmill had robbed you of air. It sounds absurd, but it happened. Let's pause on the engineering quirks again. Windmills weren't just about sails turning in the breeze. Inside, they had complex gear systems, transferring the motion of the sails to the millstones. The angle of the sails had to be adjusted constantly to catch the wind. Some mills even had cloth sails that could be reefed like a ship's, depending on the weather. So, in a way, running a windmill was like sailing a stationary boat. The miller was both engineer and sailor, trimming his sails to the invisible currents of the air. And then there's the cultural symbolism. Windmills quickly became romanticized. They stood tall, proud, and slightly whimsical. Painters loved them. Poets wrote about them. They became symbols of resilience, of human ingenuity, of the quiet dignity of rural life. Which is ironic, because in reality, they were noisy, dusty, and often resented. But history has a way of polishing rough edges into nostalgia. Now, let's drift into the global spread. Because windmills weren't just a European thing. They appeared in Persia as early as the 9th century, with vertical axis designs that looked very different from the European kind. These Persian mills used sails made of reeds or cloth, turning slowly in the desert wind. From there, the idea spread westward, eventually reaching Europe during the Crusades. So yes, the iconic Dutch windmill has its roots in the Middle East. History is full of these quiet connections. Let's not forget the literary afterlife. Don Quixote tilting at windmills, mistaking them for giants. That single image cemented windmills in the cultural imagination forever. They became symbols of futility, of hopeless battles, of noble but misguided quests. And yet, at the same time, they remained practical, grinding grain, pumping water, sawing wood. It's a strange duality. In literature, they're metaphors for madness. In reality, they were the backbone of daily life. And here's a quirky little fact. Windmills sometimes became defensive structures, just like watermills. Their tall towers made excellent lookout points. In times of war, soldiers could climb them to spot approaching enemies. Some were even fortified with thick walls and narrow windows. Imagine a windmill doubling as a watchtower, its sails turning lazily while archers peered out from the top. So, we've already seen windmills as the flashy newcomers, the tall wooden cousins of the squat, soggy watermills. But let's linger on the daily life of a windmill for a moment, because it wasn't all picturesque sails against the sky. Inside, the atmosphere was dusty, very dusty. Flour dust clung to everything. The gears creaked, the stones rumbled, and the sails outside groaned as they caught the wind. The miller had to keep a constant eye on the weather. Too much wind, and the sails could spin out of control, tearing themselves apart. Too little wind, and the whole operation ground to a halt. So, the miller became part engineer, part sailor, part gambler, always adjusting, always hoping the breeze would cooperate. And of course, because this was the Middle Ages, people blamed the miller for everything. If the flour was too coarse, his fault. If the wind didn't blow, somehow still his fault. If the sails broke in a storm, definitely his fault. It's a wonder millers didn't just pack up and become shepherds. Let's drift into the aesthetics of windmills, because unlike watermills, they became icons. Painters loved them. They dotted the horizon, tall and proud, their sails turning slowly in the breeze. They became symbols of rural life, of human ingenuity, of the quiet dignity of farming communities. Which is ironic, because in reality, they were noisy, dusty, and often resented. But nostalgia has a way of sanding off the rough edges. And in the Netherlands, especially, windmills became part of the national identity. They weren't just grinding grain. They were pumping water, draining marshes, literally reshaping the land. Without them, much of the country would still be underwater. So, when you see a Dutch windmill today, you're not just looking at a quaint tourist attraction. You're looking at the machine that made the country possible. Now, let's pause on the lawsuits over wind again, because they're too good to skip. Medieval courts actually had to decide who owned the breeze. If your neighbor's windmill blocked your wind, you could sue. Judges had to listen to solemn arguments about stolen gusts of air. Imagine the paperwork. Case number 47. Peter versus Jan, concerning the theft of wind. It sounds absurd, but it was deadly serious. Because no wind meant no flour, and no flour meant no bread. Let's wander into the global connections again. Because while Europe was perfecting its post mills and tower mills, Persia had already been using vertical axis windmills for centuries. These looked very different, more like big wooden drums with sails inside, turning slowly in the desert wind. They were used to grind grain and pump water, just like their European cousins. And it's likely that the ideas spread westward during the Crusades, carried by travelers who saw them in action. So, the European windmill wasn't an isolated invention. It was part of a much larger story of human ingenuity, stretching across continents. And then there's the literary afterlife. Don Quixote tilting at windmills, mistaking them for giants. That single image stuck in the cultural imagination forever. Windmills became symbols of futility, of hopeless battles, of noble but misguided quests. And yet, at the same time, they remained practical, grinding grain, pumping water, sawing wood. It's a strange duality. In literature, they're metaphors for madness. In reality, they were the backbone of daily life. Now, let's drift into the engineering evolution. Early post mills were clumsy. The whole structure had to be rotated to face the wind. Imagine shoving an entire wooden house around every time the breeze shifted. Tower mills were the upgrade. Only the top part rotated, while the base stayed fixed. Much sturdier, much easier to manage, and far more iconic. By the 15th century, tower mills dotted the European landscape, their sails turning steadily, their bases solid and permanent. And of course, millers argued endlessly about which type was better. Some swore by the old post mills, claiming they were simpler and cheaper. Others embraced the tower mills with their sturdiness and efficiency. It was the medieval version of arguing about whether vinyl records are better than digital. Both worked. Both had their fans. And both, in the end, coexisted so. We've wandered through the tall silhouettes of windmills, standing proud against the sky, their sails creaking as they caught the breeze. We've seen them as rivals to the old, damp water mills, one rooted in rivers, the other in air. We've watched millers wrestle with the weather, trimming sails like sailors, praying for just enough wind but not too much. We've drifted past the lawsuits over stolen breezes, the endless grumbling about millers' fees, and the strange duality of windmills as both practical machines and cultural icons. In literature, they became giants to tilted symbols of futility and madness. In reality, they were the backbone of rural economies, grinding grain, pumping water, sawing timber, and even draining entire landscapes. We've seen how they reshaped the Low Countries, turning marsh into farmland, literally creating land where there had been sea. We've traced their roots back to Persia, where vertical axis mills turned slowly in desert winds and followed their spread across Europe, where they became landmarks, metaphors, and eventually nostalgic symbols of a simpler age, And through it all, the same quiet truth, whether powered by water or wind, these machines represented something bigger. They were humanity's first great step toward harnessing nature on a large scale. They were the ancestors of engines, factories, and industry. They were the creaky, dusty, slightly resented beginnings of the modern world. So, we've spent a long while with our creaky water wheels and our breezy windmills. By the 16th and 17th centuries, though something was changing. The world was getting bigger, faster, and a little more complicated. Trade was booming, cities were swelling, and suddenly, the humble mill, once the pride of a village, was being asked to do a lot more than just grind grain. This was the era when mills started to look less like rustic huts and more like proto-factories. They weren't just tucked away on riversides anymore. They were being built bigger, stronger, and more specialized. And the people who owned them weren't just lords and abbots. Increasingly, they were merchants, investors, and entrepreneurs. In other words, the mill was slipping out of the feudal world and into the capitalist one. Let's drift into the new jobs for old wheels. Because by the early modern period, mills were powering all sorts of industries. Ironworks, water wheels, drove bellows that kept furnaces blazing hot, fueling the production of cannons, tools, and nails, paper mills. Rag pulp was beaten into sheets, feeding the growing appetite for books after the printing press took off. Without mills, Gutenberg's revolution would have been a lot slower. Textiles, fulling mills pounded cloth, dye mills processed fabrics, and spinning machines began to appear. The textile industry was basically a mill industry. Mining wheels pumped water out of mines, keeping tunnels dry enough for workers to dig deeper. So the mill was no longer just about bread. It was about iron, paper, cloth, and coal. It was about industry now. Let's pause on the social shift. Because in the Middle Ages, mills were tied to lords and monasteries. By the 17th century, they were increasingly tied to towns and private investors. This was a big deal. It meant that power, both literal and economic, was moving away from feudal estates and into the hands of merchants. The mill was quietly helping to dismantle the old order. And of course, this created tension. Lords didn't want to lose their monopoly on milling. Towns wanted independence. Merchants wanted profit. Peasants just wanted cheaper flour. The result? Endless disputes, lawsuits, and occasional riots. Because nothing says early modern Europe like a riot over bread prices. Let's drift into the technology creep again. Because as mills got bigger, people started tinkering with ways to make them more efficient. Gears got stronger. Wheels got larger. Some mills had multiple wheels, each powering a different machine. And inventors began to dream of something even more radical. Machines that didn't rely on rivers or wind at all. Machines that could run anywhere, anytime. Enter the steam engine. At first, it was just a clumsy contraption for pumping water out of mines. But over time, it evolved into something far more powerful. And when it did, it quietly began to replace the old mills. No more waiting for the river to flow or the wind to blow. With steam, you could grind grain, hammer iron, or spin cloth whenever you wanted. The age of mills was giving way to the age of machines. But here's the thing, the transition wasn't sudden. Water and windmills didn't just vanish overnight. They kept churning away well into the 18th and even 19th centuries. In some places, they're still turning today. The Industrial Revolution didn't erase them. It just overshadowed them. They went from being the cutting edge of technology to being quaint relics. Still useful, but no longer revolutionary. Let's pause on the cultural memory. Because even as steam engines roared and factories rose, people kept looking back at mills with nostalgia. Painters kept painting them. Poets kept writing about them. They became symbols of a simpler, slower world, even though, in reality, they had always been noisy, dusty, and resented. It's funny how history works. The things people once cursed become the things they later romanticize. And here's a quirky little fact. Some early factories were literally called mills, even when they weren't powered by water or wind anymore. Cotton mills, steel mills, paper mills. The word stuck long after the wheel was gone. It's a reminder of just how central the mill had been. Even when industry moved on, the language of milling lingered so. We left off with mills quietly handing the torch to steam engines. But let's linger a little longer in that in-between world, where water and wind still dominated. But the first hints of industry were creeping in. Picture a 17th century town. The river still hums with water wheels. The countryside still dotted with windmills. But now there's more demand. More grain to grind, more cloth to full, more iron to hammer. The old wheels are working overtime, creaking under the strain. And in the background, inventors are tinkering with strange contraptions. Pistons, boilers, pumps. Things that hiss and clank instead of creak and splash. The mill is no longer just a village utility. It's becoming part of a network of production. Grain milled here is shipped to cities. Cloth fulled here is sold abroad. Iron hammered here becomes part of cannons, ships, and tools. The wheel is turning not just for the village, but for the world. Let's drift into the colonial connection. Because by the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe's appetite for goods was exploding. Sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from India, tobacco from the Americas. And mills were at the heart of processing it all. Sugar mills crushed cane into syrup. Cotton mills spun fibers into thread. Tobacco mills ground leaves into powder. The old medieval wheel had gone global, feeding empires as well as villages. And of course, this meant more money. Investors poured cash into mills. Merchants built bigger ones. Towns competed to attract them. The mill was no longer just a creaky wooden hut by the river. It was a business venture, a profit machine, a symbol of modernity. Now, let's pause on the social consequences. Because as mills grew, so did inequality. The owners got richer. The workers, often children, often women, got dustier, tireder, and poorer. The old village miller, shady but independent, was being replaced by wage laborers, grinding away for someone else's profit. The resentment didn't vanish. It just shifted targets. And of course, there were protests. Workers smashed machines, rioted over bread prices, demanded fairer wages. The mill, once a symbol of feudal oppression, became a symbol of industrial exploitation. Different system, same complaints. Let's drift into the technology creep again. Because mills didn't just sit still while steam engines rose. They adapted. Engineers built bigger wheels, stronger gears, more efficient sluices. Some mills had multiple wheels, each powering a different machine. Others combined water and wind, hedging their bets against nature. And in some places, mills were even retrofitted with early steam engines, creating hybrid machines that looked like something out of a steampunk novel. And here's a quirky little fact. Some early factories were called mills, even when they weren't powered by wheels anymore. Cotton mills, steel mills, paper mills. The word stuck long after the technology had changed. It's a reminder of just how central the mill had been. Even when industry moved on, the language of milling lingered. Now, let's pause on the cultural nostalgia. Because as steam engines roared and factories rose, people began to look back at mills with a kind of wistful fondness. Painters depicted them as quaint, rustic, peaceful. Poets wrote about them as symbols of a simpler age. Never mind that, in reality, they had always been noisy, dusty, and resented. History has a way of turning yesterday's nuisances into today's nostalgia. So, we've already seen how mills expanded beyond bread into iron, paper, textiles, and mining. But let's linger on the textile connection, because it's here that the mill really became the backbone of early modern industry. Cloth was everything in the 16th and 17th centuries. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about trade, wealth, and status. Wool from England, linen from Flanders, silk from Italy. And every piece of cloth had to be processed. Fulling mills pounded it, dye mills colored it, and eventually, spinning and weaving machines began to appear. The textile industry was basically a giant chain of mills. Without them, Europe would have been a lot colder and a lot poorer. And of course, because this is history, there was resentment. Traditional cloth workers complained that mills were putting them out of business. They protested, sometimes violently. It was an early version of the machines are stealing our jobs debate. Spoiler, the machines won. Now, let's drift into the paper mills, because they quietly changed the world. Before mills, making paper was slow, laborious, and expensive. But with water-powered hammers pulping rags into sheets, production skyrocketed. And just in time, too, because the printing press had arrived. Suddenly, books weren't just for monks and nobles. They were for merchants, students, even ordinary townsfolk. And behind every book was a mill, churning out the paper. So, in a way, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment all owed a debt to some creaky water wheels pounding rags into pulp. Let's pause on the iron mills, because they were loud, smoky, and essential. Water wheels powered bellows that kept furnaces blazing hot, hot enough to smelt iron on a scale never seen before. The iron became cannons, muskets, nails, tools, and eventually rails. Without mills, Europe's wars would have been fought with fewer guns and its cities built with fewer nails. So yes, the humble water wheel was indirectly responsible for both destruction and construction. And then there's the mining connection. Mines flooded constantly. Without pumps, they were useless. Enter the water wheel, powering pumps that kept tunnels dry. This allowed miners to dig deeper, extracting more coal and metal. And more coal meant more fuel for furnaces, more iron, more industry. It was a feedback loop, all powered by water. Until, of course, steam engines came along and did it better. But for a while, the wheel was king. Now, let's drift into the urban shift. Because by the 17th century, mills weren't just rural anymore. They were moving into towns and cities. Urban rivers were lined with mills, their wheels turning side by side, powering workshops and factories. The sound must have been constant, a low rumble of water and stone echoing through the streets. For city dwellers, the mill wasn't a quaint rural landmark. It was part of the urban soundtrack. And of course, this created new problems. Pollution, overcrowding, noise. People complained that mills stank, that they clogged rivers, that they made life miserable. Which, to be fair, they did. But they also provided jobs, goods, and money. So, as always, people grumbled but adapted. Let's pause on the language of mills, because it lingered even as technology changed. Cotton mills, steel mills, paper mills, the word mill became shorthand for factory. Even when the wheels were gone, the name remained. It's a reminder of how deeply the mill was embedded in the collective imagination. The Industrial Revolution didn't erase the mill. It just rebranded it. And here's a quirky little fact. Some early steam engines were installed in old mill buildings. The wheel was ripped out, the gears replaced, and suddenly the same building that had once relied on a river was hissing with steam. It was a strange hybrid moment when the old and the new coexisted under the same roof. Imagine standing in a mill, hearing the familiar creak of wood replaced by the hiss and clank of iron. It must have felt like stepping into the future so far. We've seen mills expand into textiles, paper, iron, and mining. But let's linger on the breadth of their reach. Because by the 17th and 18th centuries, mills were everywhere. They weren't just tucked away in villages anymore. They were in towns, cities, colonies. They were powering industries that stretched across continents. Think of sugar mills in the Caribbean, grinding cane under the tropical sun. Cotton mills in India, spinning fibers that would end up in European markets. Paper mills in Italy, feeding the presses of Venice. The mill had gone global. What started as a creaky wheel on a muddy riverbank was now part of an international web of trade, empire, and profit. Let's pause on the colonial sugar mills, because they were brutal. Powered by water, wind, or animals, they crushed cane into syrup, which was then boiled into sugar. Sweetness for Europe, misery for the enslaved workers who labored in them. It's a reminder that technology is never neutral. The same wheel that ground grain in a sleepy English village was grinding cane in the Caribbean, fueling both deserts and exploitation. Now, let's drift back to Europe and the urban mills. By the 18th century, rivers running through cities were lined with wheels. They powered sawmills, paper mills, textile mills. The sound must have been constant, a low, mechanical hum echoing through the streets. For city dwellers, the mill wasn't quaint or rustic. It was industrial, noisy, and unavoidable. And of course, people complained. Mills clogged rivers, polluted water, and stank. They were essential, but they were also nuisances. Which, to be fair, is a theme that runs through all of history's technologies. Let's pause on the transition to steam again, because it's worth savoring. At first, steam engines were clumsy, inefficient, and expensive. But they had one huge advantage: independence. No river required, no wind needed. You could put a steam engine anywhere, anytime, and it would run. That was revolutionary. And so, slowly, mills began to lose their monopoly. Steam engines crept into old mill buildings, replacing wheels with pistons. The familiar creak and splash gave way to the hiss and clank of iron. It must have felt uncanny. The same building, the same work, but a completely different soundscape. Now, let's drift into the language of continuity. Because even as steam took over, people kept calling factories mills. Cotton mills, steel mills, paper mills. The word stuck long after the wheel was gone. It's a reminder of how deeply the mill was embedded in the collective imagination. The Industrial Revolution didn't erase the mill. It just rebranded it. And here's a quirky little detail. Some early industrialists deliberately built their steam-powered factories to look like traditional mills. Stone walls, pitched roofs, even fake water wheels. Why? Because people trusted mills. They were familiar, part of the landscape. A giant iron engine might look frightening, but a building that looked like a mill, that felt safe. It was a kind of architectural camouflage, easing people into the new world of industry. Let's not forget the cultural nostalgia. As factories rose and cities filled with smoke, people began to look back at mills with fondness. Painters depicted them as peaceful, rustic. Poets wrote about them as symbols of a simpler age. Never mind that, in reality, they had always been noisy, dusty, and resented. Nostalgia has a way of polishing the past until it gleams. So, we've wandered through the world of early modern mills, no longer just village bread makers, but global engines of empire. We've seen them crush sugar in the Caribbean, pulp rags into paper for Europe's new readers, hammer iron for wars and nails, and pump water from mines so coal could fuel the future. The mill had gone from local utility to international powerhouse. We've watched them move from feudal lords and monasteries into the hands of merchants and investors, shifting the balance of power along with the flow of rivers. We've seen them creep into cities, lining urban rivers with their wheels, filling the air with the constant rumble of industry. And we've seen them slowly give way to steam, first as awkward hybrids, then as relics overshadowed by pistons and boilers. And yet, the language lingered. Cotton mills, steel mills, paper mills. The word mill survived long after the wheel was gone. Even as factories rose and smokestacks darkened the sky, people still called them mills, a quiet reminder of where it all began. And in culture, the nostalgia grew. Painters and poets turned mills into symbols of a simpler, slower world. Never mind that they had always been noisy, dusty, and resented. History has a way of polishing the past until it gleams. So, we've followed mills from their medieval heyday, through their early modern expansion, and into their quiet handoff to steam. But the story doesn't end there, because mills didn't just vanish. They lingered, they decayed, they became ruins, memories, metaphors. In their afterlives, they turned from machines into symbols. Picture an abandoned mill on a riverbank. The wheel is broken, half submerged in water. The roof has caved in. Moss creeps over the stones. Birds nest in the rafters. The river still flows, but the wheel no longer turns. For villagers walking past, it's no longer a workplace. It's a landmark, a reminder of what once was, and, inevitably, a source of ghost stories. Let's pause on the haunted mill trope, because it's everywhere. People swore they heard phantom, wheels turning at night, or saw ghostly millers carrying sacks of grain. Some said the devil himself liked to lurk in old mills. And honestly, if you've ever stood near a ruined mill at dusk, with the water trickling through broken sluices and the timbers creaking in the wind, you can see why. It's eerie. Mills were already associated with greed, dishonesty, and uncanny power. Add abandonment, and you had the perfect recipe for a haunted reputation. In folklore, the mill became a liminal space. Not quite natural, not quite human, somewhere in between. Now, let's drift into the romantic nostalgia. By the 18th and 19th centuries, poets and painters were obsessed with ruins. Castles, abbeys, mills, anything crumbling and overgrown was fair game. A ruined mill by a river was perfect. It symbolized the passage of time, the decay of industry, the return of nature. Painters loved the contrast of mossy stone and flowing water. Poets loved the metaphor of a wheel that once turned, now stilled forever. And of course, city dwellers, choking on factory smoke, looked at old mills with wistful fondness. They imagined them as peaceful, rustic, idyllic. Never mind that, in reality, they had been noisy, dusty, and resented. Nostalgia has a way of polishing the past until it gleams. Let's pause on the lingering utility, because not all mills became ruins. Some kept working quietly into the 19th and even 20th centuries. In remote villages, water and wind power was still cheaper than steam or electricity. Even today, in parts of Europe, you can find old mills still grinding grain, still turning slowly, still doing the job they were built for centuries ago. They're living fossils, creaking reminders of a world that once was. And here's a quirky little fact. Some mills were repurposed. In the 19th century, old mill buildings were turned into homes, inns, even factories for new industries. The wheel might be gone, but the sturdy stone walls remained. Today, converted mill is real estate gold. People pay fortunes to live in what was once a dusty, noisy workplace. It's the ultimate irony. The building peasants once cursed is now a luxury home with exposed beams and river views. Now, let's drift into the cultural memory, because even when the wheels stopped turning, the mill lived on in language. Phrases like grist for the mill or run of the mill are still with us. They're little echoes of a world where everyone knew what a mill was, how it worked, and why it mattered. Even if most people today have never seen a working mill, the words linger. Mills as ruins in the landscape. By the 19th century, many mills had fallen silent. Rivers shifted, trade routes changed, steam and electricity took over, but the buildings remained. And unlike castles or cathedrals, mills weren't built to impress. They were built to last. Thick stone walls, heavy beams, sturdy foundations, which meant that even when the wheels stopped, the shell endured. Travelers in the Romantic era loved stumbling across these ruins. A mossy mill by a stream was the perfect subject for a watercolor sketch. It whispered of industry past, of human effort reclaimed by nature. The wheel might be broken, but the river still flowed. Indifferent, haunted mills and folklore abandoned mills quickly became magnets for ghost stories. People swore they heard phantom wheels turning at night, or saw spectral millers trudging with sacks of grain. Some tales claimed the devil himself had once worked the wheel, and his presence lingered. Folklore often painted mills as liminal spaces, not quite natural, not quite human. They were noisy, mechanical, uncanny. When they fell silent, that strangeness only deepened. A ruined mill at dusk, with water trickling through broken sluices, was the perfect stage for a haunting. Mills in art and literature. Painters of the Romantic period adored mills. They appeared in landscapes by Constable, Turner, and countless lesser-known artists. Sometimes they were shown bustling with life, sometimes crumbling into ruin. Either way, they symbolized the passage of time, the blending of human effort and natural force. In literature, mills became metaphors. The grinding of grain stood for the grinding of fate. The endless turning of the wheel echoed the endless turning of fortune. And in poetry, a ruined mill often symbolized lost innocence, the decay of tradition, or the inevitability of change. Mills reborn. Not all mills were left to rot. Some were repurposed. In the 19th and 20th centuries, old mill buildings were converted into homes, inns, even factories for new industries. Their sturdy walls made them perfect for reuse. Today, converted mill is real estate gold. People pay fortunes to live in what was once a dusty, noisy workplace. Exposed beams, stone walls, river views, the very things peasants once cursed are now luxury features. It's the ultimate irony. The building once resented as a symbol of oppression is now cherished as a symbol of charm. Mills that still turn end in some places, the wheels never stopped. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, you can still find working water and windmills. Some grind grain for tourists. Some still produce flour for local bakeries. Some pump water or saw timber. They're living fossils, creaking reminders of a world that once was. Standing beside one, you can hear the same sounds that peasants heard 800 years ago. The splash of water, the groan of wood, the rumble of stone. It's like stepping back in time. Mills in language and memory. If most people today have never seen a working mill, the memory lingers in words. Grist for the mill, meaning raw material for thought. Run of the mill, meaning ordinary, unremarkable. Millstone around the neck, meaning a heavy burden. These phrases are little echoes of a world where everyone knew what a mill was, how it worked, and why it mattered. The technology may be gone, but the metaphor still grinds on, closing the afterlife so. In their afterlives, mills became many things: ruins, ghosts, metaphors, homes, museums, tourist attractions, and words on our tongues. They remind us that technology doesn't just vanish. It lingers, reshaped by memory, nostalgia, and imagination. The wheel may have stopped turning, but in culture, it never really stopped. It keeps grinding away in the background, a quiet echo of humanity's first great attempt to harness nature on a massive scale. So, we've wandered among the mossy ruins, where broken wheels sit half submerged in rivers, and roofs sag under ivy. We've listened to the ghost stories, phantom millers trudging with sacks of grain, wheels turning in the night with no water to drive them, whispers of the devil lurking in the sleep. We've seen how painters and poets turned mills into symbols of time, fate, and loss, polishing their noisy, dusty reality into something wistful and romantic. We've watched mills reborn as homes, inns, and museums, their sturdy stone walls now admired as character rather than endured as drudgery. We've noticed how the language of milling lingers in our speech: grist for the mill, run of the mill, millstone around the neck. Even when the wheels stopped, the metaphors kept grinding on, and in some places, we've seen them still turning, living fossils, creaking away in quiet valleys, grinding flour for tourists or for local bread, reminders that the past never fully disappears. So, in their afterlives, mills became more than machines. They became ruins, ghosts, metaphors, and memories. They remind us that technology doesn't simply vanish. It lingers, reshaped by nostalgia, imagination, and culture. The wheel may have stopped, but in art, in language, and in the landscape, it never really did. From rivers to steam, we began with water wheels turning on muddy riverbanks, grinding grain for villagers. Then came tidal mills, monastic empires, and bridge mills. Windmills rose on the horizon, their sails catching the sky. Mills expanded into iron, paper, textiles, and mining, fueling empires and feeding revolutions. And finally, steam engines hissed and clanked, overshadowing the old wheels but never quite erasing them. The story of mills is the story of humanity's first great attempt to harness nature on a massive scale. Before electricity, Before engines, before factories, there were wheels turning in rivers and sails creaking in the wind. They were the quiet ancestors of industry. From machines to metaphors, when the wheels stopped, they didn't vanish. They lingered as ruins, as ghosts, as metaphors. Painters and poets turned them into symbols of time, fate, and nostalgia. Folklore filled them with spirits and devils. Language kept them alive in phrases like grist for the mill and run of the mill. Even when the technology faded, the memory kept grinding on. From oppression to charm once, resented as symbols of feudal control. Mills are now cherished as heritage, converted into homes, inns, and museums. They've become quaint, picturesque, even luxurious. The dusty, noisy workplaces peasants once cursed are now admired for their beams, their stone walls, their river views. History has a sense of irony. The wheel that never stops so. What do we make of it all? The mill is more than a machine. It's a reminder of continuity, of how human ingenuity takes what nature offers, water, wind, tide, and bends it to our needs, of how technology reshapes society, and how society, in turn, reshapes technology. The wheel may have slowed, but it never really stopped. It keeps turning in our language, our culture, our nostalgia. It keeps turning in the ruins by rivers, in the sails on Dutch horizons, in the creak of a tourist mill grinding flour for bread. It keeps turning in the factories and engines that inherited its legacy. The mill is the quiet heartbeat of history, always grinding, always turning, always reminding us that progress is never sudden. It's a wheel, turning slowly, endlessly, carrying us forward. And with that, the saga of mills, from medieval rivers to modern memory, comes to its close. The wheel rests, but its echo lingers. Mills as the first engines of globalization by the time steam and electricity took over. Mills had already done something extraordinary. They had tied the world together. Sugar mills in the Caribbean, cotton mills in India, paper mills in Italy, windmills in the Netherlands, all of them were part of a global web of production. The wheel was no longer just a village tool. It was a global engine, and in that sense, mills were the first step toward the interconnected world we live in today. They were the quiet machinery behind empires, revolutions, and trade routes. Without them, the modern world would have been slower to arrive. The symbol of time, the mill wheel became one of the great metaphors of human existence. Always turning, always grinding, indifferent to who brought the grain. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone's wheat ended up between the same stones. Preachers used it as a reminder of fate. Poets used it as a symbol of time. Philosophers saw in it the endless cycle of fortune. Even today, when most people have never seen a working mill, the image of the wheel turning still resonates. It's a reminder that life, like flour, is ground down in the end. From utility to heritage, what began as a practical machine has become heritage. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, old mills are preserved as museums, tourist attractions, or simply as ruins left to the elements. They are cherished not for their utility, but for their history. People visit them to feel connected to the past, to hear the creak of wood and the splash of water, to imagine a world before engines and electricity. The lingering language, and of course, the mill lives on in our words. Grist for the mill, raw material for thought, run of the mill, ordinary, unremarkable, millstone around the neck, a heavy burden, These phrases are little fossils of a world where everyone knew the sound of a wheel turning, the feel of flour dust in the air, the weight of a sack of grain. Even if the machines are gone, the language keeps them alive, the final turn. So, what do we make of it all? The story of mills is the story of humanity's first great leap into harnessing nature. Before engines, before electricity, before factories, there were wheels turning in rivers and sails creaking in the wind. They were noisy, dusty, resented, and utterly essential. They fed villages, fueled empires, inspired poets, haunted ruins, and lingered in memory. They were the heartbeat of the medieval world, the backbone of the early modern one, and the ancestors of the industrial age. The wheel may have slowed, but it never really stopped. It keeps turning in our culture, our language, our nostalgia. It keeps turning in the ruins by rivers, in the sails on Dutch horizons, in the creak of tourist mills grinding flour for bread. It keeps turning in the factories and engines that inherited its legacy. The mill is the quiet reminder that progress is not a straight line, but a wheel turning slowly, endlessly, carrying us forward. So we've followed the mill from its medieval birth on muddy riverbanks, through its golden age of water and wind, into its early modern expansion across empires, and finally into its quiet handoff to steam and industry. We've seen it as a machine, a workplace, a symbol, a ruin, a ghost, and a memory. The mill was never just about flour. It was about power, economic, social, and symbolic. It fed villages, enriched lords, funded monasteries, fueled empires, and eventually inspired nostalgia. It was cursed as oppressive, romanticized as rustic, and remembered as timeless. Even when the wheels stopped turning, the mill never really disappeared. It lingered in ruins by rivers, in ghost stories whispered at dusk, in paintings and poems, in the language we still use today. It lingers in the very word mill, carried forward into factories and industries that no longer needed water or wind. And so, the story of the mill is the story of humanity's first great leap into harnessing nature. Before engines, before electricity, before factories, there was the wheel, turning slowly, endlessly, carrying us forward. The wheel may rest now, moss-covered and silent in some forgotten valley. But in memory, in culture, in language, it still turns. Quietly, steadily, forever. The mill as a mirror of humanity. The mill is at its heart a mirror. It reflects the societies that built it. In the Middle Ages, it was feudal control and monastic wealth. In the early modern world, it was commerce, empire, and industry. In its ruins, it became nostalgia, poetry, and ghosts. The wheel turned, and with it, human history turned too. The balance of nature and technology. Mills remind us of the delicate balance between harnessing nature and respecting it. A river diverted to power a wheel could feed a village, or flood a neighbor's field. A windmill could drain a marsh to create farmland, or spark lawsuits over stolen breezes. Every gain came with a cost, and that tension between innovation and consequence is still with us today. The slow grind of progress, the story of mills, also reminds us that progress is rarely sudden. It grinds slowly, like grain between stones. The leap from water wheels to steam engines looks dramatic in hindsight, but it was centuries in the making. Each creak of a wheel, each adjustment of a sluice, each lawsuit over water rights, all of it was part of the long, slow grind toward modernity. The wheel that still turns even now, the mill lingers. In our language, in our landscapes, in our imagination. We still speak of grist for the mill. We still admire windmills on Dutch horizons. We still visit old water mills, listening to their creaks as if they're whispering secrets from the past. The wheel may have slowed, but it never truly stopped. So, what does the mill teach us? That technology is never just about machines. It's about people, their needs, their conflicts, their dreams, their ghosts. The mill was never just a wheel in water or sails in wind. It was a stage where human history played out, endlessly turning, endlessly grinding. The mill as prototype of industry. Every factory, every power plant, every humming machine owes something to the mill. The logic is the same. Take a natural force, channel it, and make it do work. The water wheel and windmill were the first great prototypes of mechanization. When we look at a hydroelectric dam or a wind turbine today, we're really looking at the descendants of those medieval contraptions. The wheel never stopped, it just changed shape. The mill and sustainability, ironically, in an age of climate anxiety, the mill feels modern again. Water power and wind power, once abandoned for coal and steam, are now celebrated as clean, renewable energy. The sleek white blades of a wind turbine are just the futuristic cousins of the Dutch windmill. The giant turbines in hydroelectric dams are the grandchildren of the creaky water wheels by medieval rivers. What was once old-fashioned is now cutting-edge again. The mill in culture and storytelling. The mill also lives on in our imagination. In literature, it remains a symbol of futility. Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, of oppression, the millstone as burden, and of fate, the grinding wheel of time. In art, it's a favorite motif. From romantic landscapes to modern photography, in film and games. Mills often appear as atmospheric settings, rustic, eerie, or picturesque. They're shorthand for the past, for something both familiar and uncanny. The mill as heritage across the world. Mills are preserved as museums, tourist attractions, or converted into homes. They're cherished not for their utility, but for their character. People visit them to feel connected to history, to hear the creak of wood and the splash of water, to imagine a slower, steadier world. The irony is sharp. Once resented as symbols of control and taxation, mills are now celebrated as symbols of tradition and charm. The endless grind at its simplest, the mill is about grinding. Grain into flour, cane into sugar, rags into paper. But as a metaphor, it's about the grind of life itself. Work, repetition, effort, the sense that we are all, in some way, carried along by wheels larger than ourselves. The millstone becomes a symbol of burden, of inevitability, of the slow but steady reduction of raw material into something usable. Cycles and continuity. The wheel turns, the river flows, the wind blows. Mills remind us that life is cyclical. Seasons return, fortunes rise and fall, history repeats. The mill doesn't rush. It turns at its own pace, indifferent to human impatience. In that sense, it's a lesson in humility. We may think we control the wheel, but really, we're just adjusting sails and sluices, nudging nature rather than mastering it. Power and dependence mills also reveal the paradox of power. They gave humans the ability to harness nature, to multiply effort, to feed more people, to build more things. But they also created dependence. Villages relied on the miller, towns relied on the river, empires relied on the wheel. And when the wheel stopped, when the river dried, when the wind failed, everything faltered. The mill is a reminder that power always comes with vulnerability. The mill as memory finally. The mill is memory itself. It lingers in ruins, in language, in culture. It's a reminder that even when technologies fade, their echoes remain. The wheel keeps turning in our metaphors, our nostalgia, our imagination. It's the grindstone of history, shaping us long after its practical use has passed. The mill as labor made visibly unlike many machines. The mill made its work obvious. You could see the wheel turning, hear the stones grinding, smell the flour dust in the air. It was labor externalized, mechanical effort laid bare. In that sense, the mill was a constant reminder that human survival depended on work. Not hidden, but loud, dusty, and unavoidable. The wheel as faith, the turning of the wheel, became a metaphor for fate itself. Just as grain was inevitably ground down, so too were human lives shaped by forces beyond their control. The wheel turned whether you wanted it to or not. It was steady, relentless, impartial. Kings and peasants alike had their grain milled, their fortunes ground down by the same stones. The mill as social order, the mill also embodied hierarchy. The miller stood between the people and their bread, a gatekeeper of survival. Lords and abbots claimed rights over mills, enforcing monopolies. The wheel was not just a machine, it was a symbol of power, of who controlled resources, of who profited from necessity. In that sense, the mill was a microcosm of society itself, labor at the bottom, profit at the top, and the wheel grinding in between. The mill as memory of time even in ruins. Mills remind us of time's passage. A broken wheel by a river is a clock of sorts, not ticking, but decaying. It shows how human effort, no matter how sturdy, is eventually worn down. Yet the river still flows, the wind still blows. Nature endures, indifferent to the machines we build. The mill becomes a monument to lessons for the present and future. This is where the saga of mills stops being just history and metaphor, and becomes a guide for how we think about technology, society, and ourselves today. The mill as a lesson in innovation. The story of mills shows us that innovation is rarely sudden. It's incremental, layered, and often messy. The water wheel didn't vanish when the windmill arrived. The windmill didn't vanish when steam arrived. Each technology lingered, adapted, overlapped. Progress is not a straight line, it's a wheel, turning slowly, grinding steadily. The mill and sustainability, an age of climate anxiety. The mill feels strangely modern again. Water and wind, once abandoned for coal and steam, are now celebrated as clean, renewable energy. The sleek turbine and the massive hydroelectric dam are just the mill reborn. The lesson is clear. Sometimes the future lies not in abandoning the past, but in rediscovering it. The mill and power mills remind us that technology is never neutral. They were tools of survival, but also tools of control. Lords and abbots monopolized them. Merchants profited from them. Workers labored under them. Every new machine reshapes society, redistributing power as much as it redistributes energy. The same is true today, whether we're talking about data centers, AI, or renewable grids. The wheel always turns, but who controls it matters. The mill and human rhythm. The mill also teaches us about rhythm. It turned with the river, with the wind, with the seasons. It was tied to nature's pace. Steam and electricity broke that rhythm, creating machines that could run anytime, anywhere. That was liberating, but also exhausting. The mill reminds us that there is wisdom in slowness, in cycles, in respecting the pace of the world around us. The mill as a guide. So what does the mill teach us for the future? That progress is cyclical, not linear. That sustainability often means looking backward as well as forward. That technology always reshapes power, and we must be mindful of who holds the wheel. That sometimes the grind of the wheel is not just labor, but balance, a reminder to move with the world, not against it. And so, the saga of mills ends not with silence, but with continuity. The wheel that once turned in rivers and winds now turns in turbines and grids. The metaphors linger, the ruins remain, the language endures. The mill is not gone. It is with us still, in our energy, our culture, our imagination. The wheel turns. It always has. It always will.